What the hell is your delay, Captain? Doss.
Doctor, but didn't get much school.
What?
Private Doss.
Waiting for what?
I can't stay here while all them go.
War is just going to fit in with your ideas.
Fight for me. That's gonna be my way to serve. While everybody else is taking life,
What you figure?
I can't touch it. Gonna be saving it.
Trying to bring death to the enemy.
Well, I'm sorry, Sergeant.
You don't kill. You know quite a bit of killing
Not look to him.
No, sir.
Private Doss
does occur in war.
violence. Does not believe in on the battle.
What is?
You
I think this is a question of.
him to save you.
Myself if I don't stay true.
I think
with you because
this is Cal.
prison.
But I don't know how I'm gonna. With the world apart from what I believe.
You're saying you could go to
I'm so set on tearing itself.
you weren't like
Doesn't seem like such a bad thing to me to want to put a little bit of it back together.
Yourself without a single weapon to protect.
anyone else.
Private Doss, you are free to run into the hellfire of battle.
That's the card.
I'm gonna get you home.
They go back up.
There's something you gotta see.
Who did this?
The first sound Desmond Doss ever learned to fear wasn't gunfire. It was his father's voice at night, heavy with drink, shaking the walls of their small Virginia home. The house would hold its breath. His mother would whisper prayers under her breath. And young Desmond would watch his older brother, fists clenched, ready to fight back. One night, it almost went too far. Hands around a throat. Rage winning. And something inside Desmond snapped awake. Violence, he learned early, doesn't end anything. It only multiplies itself. Years later, that lesson still lives in his bones. You can see it in the way he walks, careful, almost apologetic. In the way he avoids confrontation, even when men twice his size try to bait him. Desmond Doss is not weak. He's something far more dangerous to a world addicted to force. He refuses to break. When war comes knocking, it doesn't ask what you believe. It doesn't care about your childhood scars or the promises you've made to God. It only demands obedience. America is burning with patriotism. Posters everywhere. Radios shouting urgency. Young men lining up, laughing, boasting, ready to prove themselves. And Desmond stands among them, hand raised, heart steady, volunteering to serve his country. There's just one problem. He will not carry a weapon. Not a rifle, not a pistol, not even to save his own life. The words land like a slap to the face of the recruiting officers. Men stare at him as if he's speaking another language. A soldier who won't kill? A medic who won't touch a gun? It sounds like a joke. Or worse, cowardice dressed up as faith. Desmond doesn't flinch. He explains it calmly. God forbids him. The commandment is clear. Thou shalt not kill. Basic training is where ideals go to die. Dust, sweat, shouting orders that strip men down to their rawest selves. And from the first day, Desmond doesn't fit. He won't hold a rifle, won't train with one, won't even touch it. The other soldiers notice. Whispers turn into laughter. Laughter turns into open hostility. They shove him, insult him, beat him in the dark when no one's watching. Each punch is an invitation to fight back. He never accepts. Instead, he prays, quietly, bruised ribs, split lip, eyes closed, not asking for strength to win, but strength to endure. Authority comes down hard. Authority comes down hard. Officers drag him into hearings. Accusations fly. Coward, traitor, liability. They try to break him with logic, with punishment, with humiliation. They tell him the truth of war, that men will die because of him, that blood will be on his hands, whether he pulls a trigger or not. Desmond listens, absorbs every word, and still refuses to bend. Somewhere in the chaos, there's one thing that keeps him grounded. Dorothy, a nurse, sharp-witted, unafraid to challenge him. She sees past the ridicule, past the stubbornness, into the quiet conviction underneath. With her, Desmond is just a man, not a problem to be solved, not a threat to tradition, just someone trying desperately to live without betraying his soul. But the world doesn't slow down for love. Orders come through. Deployment looms. The Pacific, Okinawa. A place with a name that sounds almost gentle until you hear what waits there. Hacksaw Ridge, a sheer cliff, a killing field. Soldiers don't climb it, they survive it, or they don't come back at all. The night before departure, Desmond kneels alone, hands trembling, not from fear of death, from the weight of what's coming. He knows what waits on that ridge: screams, fire, torn bodies, and a choice he will have to make over and over again, to stand firm or finally break. Because tomorrow the world will demand proof that a man can walk into hell without a weapon and still save lives. The first thing Desmond notices about Okinawa isn't the enemy, it's the sound. The island never goes quiet. Wind rattles torn leaves. Distant artillery thumps like a slow, angry heartbeat. Even the air feels tense, heavy with rot and salt and something metallic that coats the back of the throat. The men joke as they unload, but their laughter is thin, forced. Everyone knows why they're here. Hacksaw Ridge looms ahead like a wall built by God himself. A sheer cliff face rising from the earth, jagged and unforgiving. Cargo nets sway as soldiers climb, boots scraping, knuckles white. One slip, and you don't fall, you vanish. Desmond climbs last, hands burning, eyes fixed upward. No rifle slung over his shoulder, no grenades at his belt, just a medic's bag and a prayer pressed into his chest. When they reach the top, reality finally shows its teeth. The battlefield is chaos, frozen mid-scream. Craters filled with rainwater and blood. Bodies tangled in wire. Smoke rolling low, hiding movement. Somewhere out there, the enemy is waiting, patient, silent. The order comes down the line. Dig in. Hold the ridge. Desmond drops beside the others, heart pounding, fingers digging into the dirt, every instinct screaming that he does not belong here. The first shell hits without warning. The ground lifts. Men scatter. Shouts rip through the air. Another explosion. Then another. Suddenly, the ridge is alive, vomiting fire and shrapnel. Machine gun rounds tear through brush and bone alike. The men fire back, screaming, charging forward, disappearing into smoke. Desmond stays low, crawling, dragging the wounded back as bullets snap inches from his head. He presses his hands into a soldier's chest, trying to stop the bleeding. Warm. Too much. The man's eyes lock onto his. Fear. Desmond shouts reassurance he's not sure he believes himself. A medic without a gun becomes a target without teeth. He feels it, knows it, keeps moving anyway. Then the retreat order comes. Fall back. Down the ridge. Now. Panic spreads faster than the fire. Men scramble for the edge, grabbing nets, pushing past each other, desperate to escape the killing ground. Desmond helps carry one last wounded soldier toward safety when a blast throws them apart. He hits the dirt hard, ears ringing, vision swimming. When he looks up, the ridge is emptying. Men are leaving, and all around him, voices, moans, cries. Please cut short by coughing blood. Wounded men left behind, too broken to move, too far gone to scream loudly. The smoke shifts, revealing bodies everywhere, some barely breathing, some staring at the sky, waiting. Desmond's breath catches. This is it. This is the moment every officer warned him about. No orders, no protection, no witnesses. Just him, the wounded, and an enemy that could appear at any second. He crawls to the edge of the ridge and looks down. Safety is right there. One climb, one descent. He could live. Silence, Then, softly, inside his head, if I leave them, they die. He turns back, one man at a time. That's the rule he makes with himself. Don't think about tomorrow. Don't think about the enemy. Just the man in front of you. He drags the first soldier to the edge, ties a rope, lowers him down hand over hand, whispering encouragement through clenched teeth. When the rope goes slack, Desmond exhales. One saved. He moves again. Bullets crack overhead. Shapes move in the smoke. He freezes, heart slamming, then crawls forward anyway. Another wounded man. Another prayer. Another slow, agonizing drag to the cliff's edge. His hands are slick with blood. His arms shake. His voice is hoarse from calling out into the darkness. Please, Lord, help me get one more. Again, and again, and again, and again. Time loses meaning. Minutes blur into hours. His legs cramp. His shoulders scream. At one point, he feels a sharp pain tear through his side. Shrapnel. He grits his teeth and keeps going. If he stops, they die. Simple as that. Below, the men who retreated start to realize something is wrong. Bodies keep appearing. One by one, wounded soldiers are being lowered down the ridge. No one understands how. Officers stare upward, stunned. Medics rush forward, catching men who should already be dead. Someone counts. 10, 20, more. And still, someone is up there. As night deepens, the gunfire slows. The ridge goes eerily quiet. Desmond kneels beside the last man he can find, barely conscious. He ties the rope with trembling fingers, muscles screaming, faith stretched to its breaking point. He looks up at the sky, tears cutting lines through the grime on his face. Just one more, he whispers. Morning doesn't arrive gently on Hacksaw Ridge. It creeps in through smoke and ash, revealing what the dark was merciful enough to hide. Bodies everywhere. Torn uniforms. Faces frozen mid-thought. The sun rises over a field of men who never got to see it. Desmond collapses near the edge of the cliff, hands numb, body shaking uncontrollably. He doesn't remember lowering the last man, only that the rope burned his palms raw and his legs finally gave out. When soldiers climb back up, weapons ready, they stop short when they see him, still alive, still breathing. Surrounded by the wounded he couldn't save. No one speaks at first. Then the whispers start. That's him. The medic. The crazy one without a gun. Men look at Desmond differently now. Not with pity, not with contempt, with something quieter, heavier. Respect mixed with confusion. Because nothing about what he did makes sense in the world they know. Courage is supposed to roar. His whispered. Orders come fast. The ridge must be taken. Again. The enemy still controls the far side. Command wants a full assault. The men prepare, checking rifles, tightening straps, hands shaking just a little. Desmond sits apart, rewrapping his blood-soaked bandages, face pale, eyes hollow from a night without end. Then a new problem surfaces. Saturday. The Sabbath. Desmond won't pick up a weapon. Everyone knows that now. But he also won't move until he finishes praying. Officers lose patience. Time matters. Men are waiting. Lives are on the line. Someone shoves him. Someone else yells. The tension snaps tight as wire. This time, no one laughs. They've seen what he does when the bullets start flying. They've seen who he becomes when everyone else runs. The men exchange looks. Finally, a quiet decision ripples through the group. They'll wait. Under enemy fire. On open ground. They wait. Desmond kneels, head bowed, lips moving silently. The battlefield seems to hold its breath. Shells scream overhead. Dirt sprays. And still, no one moves. When he finally stands, eyes steady, something has shifted. The men follow him now. The second assault is worse. The enemy is ready. Hidden bunkers erupt with gunfire. Explosions tear through advancing lines. Men drop fast. Screams cut through the air like blades. Desmond runs straight into it, not away. He slides into craters, presses hands into wounds, drags bodies through mud and fire. Bullets rip past his ears. One clips his helmet clean off. He doesn't slow. At one point, a soldier screams for help from beyond the wire. No cover. No backup. Desmond goes anyway. Crawls through gunfire, every inch earned in pain, reaches the man just as a grenade lands nearby. The blast throws Desmond backward. Everything goes white. When his vision clears, his arm is useless. Blood pours down his sleeve. He tears a strip of cloth with his teeth, binds it tight, forces himself upright. There's still screaming. He can still hear it, so he keeps moving. Then it happens. A sniper's bullet punches into his leg. He drops hard, breath exploding out of him. Pain blooms, sharp and blinding. He tries to stand. Can't. The world tilts. Around him, the fight surges on without him. This is where he dies. He knows it. Except he doesn't. Desmond drags himself to cover, gritting his teeth, pulling with one arm, leaving a dark trail behind him. Another soldier appears, yelling, trying to help. Desmond wades him away. "You go," he gasps. "They need you." The man hesitates, then obeys. Alone again. He treats his own wounds as best he can, hands shaking, vision narrowing. When a stretcher team finally reaches him, relief washes over his face. It lasts exactly 1 second. Another man screams nearby. Desmond rolls off the stretcher. The medics shout. He ignores them. Crawls toward the sound, every movement agony, every breath a fight. He reaches the wounded soldier, patches him up, signals for help. Only then does he allow himself to be carried. As they lower him down the ridge, the world sways. Desmond stares up at the sky, clouds drifting lazily, impossibly calm. He thinks of home, of his mother's prayers, of Dorothy's smile, of the promise he made long ago to never take a life. He kept it, and in doing so, he saved more than anyone thought possible. Above him, Hacksaw Ridge stands silent now, conquered not by bullets alone, but by a man who refused to carry one. The hospital tent smells like antiseptic and damp canvas, a strange calm stitched together by groans and hurried footsteps. Desmond lies on a narrow cot, leg bound tight, arm immobilized, body finally paying the debt he's been avoiding. Every nerve hums. Every breath hurts. Doctors move around him, impressed, baffled, murmuring numbers under their breath. How many men he carried, how long he stayed up there. The story is already spreading, growing larger than the man himself. Desmond barely hears it. All he can think about is the ridge. The voices that faded into silence. The ones he couldn't reach in time. Command wants him sent home. A medical discharge. Honorably. Safely. They tell him he's done enough for 10 lifetimes. He listens politely, nodding, eyes unfocused. When they finish, he says no. Just one word. Calm. Final. The war isn't over. They argue. He doesn't. He simply waits them out, the same way he waited out. Fists, ridicule, court hearings, bullets. Eventually, resistance exhausts itself. Orders change. Desmond stays. When the medal comes, it feels almost unreal. A ceremony far from the mud and smoke. Clean uniforms. Flashing cameras. The president's voice steady, formal, reading a citation that sounds impossible. Desmond stands there, thin, quiet, hands clasped, as if afraid to touch the honor being placed around his neck. He doesn't smile much. He never learned how to celebrate survival when so many didn't get the chance. Applause thunders. Desmond hears only echoes. After the war, the noise doesn't stop. Nightmares replace gunfire. He wakes drenched in sweat, breath ragged, fingers digging into sheets that aren't there. The ridge comes back in fragments. A scream, a hand slipping, rope burning skin. Sometimes he prays. Sometimes he just sits in the dark until morning finds him. Dorothy stays. She watches him struggle with the weight no metal can lift, holds him when the shaking won't stop, loves him through silences that stretch for days. Desmond tries to explain what it's like to save lives without ever being able to forget the ones you couldn't. Words fail him. They always have. Years pass. Years pass. The world moves on. Wars change names. Heroes fade into footnotes. Desmond grows older, body stiff, breath shorter, hearing fading. His faith never does. He still believes violence only breeds more violence. Still believes mercy matters. Still believes a single person choosing differently can tilt the balance, even if only for a moment. People ask him how he did it, how he walked into hell without a weapon, how he kept going when fear should have won, how he faced death over and over again and chose compassion every time. Desmond never gives them the answer they want. He doesn't talk about bravery, or destiny, or greatness. He just says he prayed for strength and kept moving when the prayer was answered with opportunity instead of comfort. The ridge is quiet now. Grass grows where blood once pooled. The cliff stands unchanged, indifferent to memory. But the story clings to it, carried by the wind, by men who lived because one man refused to break his promise. In the end, Desmond Doss didn't change the nature of war. He changed what courage looked like inside it. The war may have ended on paper, but it never really lets go of the men who carried it home. For Desmond, peace arrives in pieces, never all at once. A quiet porch at dusk, birds settling into trees, the sound of wind instead of artillery. These moments help. They don't heal. They remind him he's still here. His body carries reminders too. The leg never fully recovers. Pain becomes a constant companion, dull some days, screaming on others. Simple tasks take longer. Pride has to be swallowed. He learns patience the hard way. Yet every morning he wakes with the same quiet determination that carried him up that ridge. Pain or not, he moves forward. Recognition follows him, whether he wants it or not. Schools invite him to speak. Churches ask him to stand before crowds. Soldiers approach him with lowered voices, eyes shining, thanking him for giving them something to believe in when belief felt impossible. Desmond listens more than he talks. When he does speak, it's never about the medal. It's about choice. About deciding, moment by moment, who you're going to be when everything is trying to tear that answer away from you. But admiration has a strange weight. Some people look at him like he's untouchable, like his faith made him immune to fear. Desmond knows better. Fear lived with him every second on that ridge. Fear rode his back as he crawled through gunfire. Fear whispered that he'd fail, that he'd be too slow, too weak, too late. Courage, he learns, isn't the absence of fear. It's carrying it anyway. Dorothy sees the cost most clearly. The way he flinches at sudden sounds. The way his eyes go distant when sirens pass. The nights when sleep won't come, no matter how tired he is. She never asks him to explain anymore. She just stays. And in that staying, Desmond finds a different kind of strength. Years later, when illness tightens its grip, Desmond faces it the same way he faced everything else. Calmly, honestly, without resentment. Doctors speak in careful tones. Prognosis, limitations. He listens, nods, thanks them. When they leave, he bows his head, not to ask why, but to give thanks for how far he's been carried. Visitors still come, young soldiers, old veterans, strangers who heard a story and needed to see if the man behind it was real. They expect someone larger than life. They find a gentle voice, a soft laugh, a man who insists on asking them how they're doing. One afternoon, a boy asks him the question everyone eventually does. Weren't you scared? Desmond smiles, really smiles, really smiles. He tells him the truth, that he was terrified, that his hand shook, that he wanted to run. Then he tells him something else, something he rarely shares. I just kept saying the same prayer, he says quietly. Not to survive, not to be brave, just let me help one more. That prayer echoes far beyond the ridge. It echoes in hospital wards where medics work until their hands ache, in disaster zones where strangers pull each other from rubble, in quiet moments where someone chooses kindness when anger would be easier. Desmond never set out to be a symbol. He just refused to compromise the line he drew in his heart. When the end finally comes, it isn't dramatic. No fanfare, no final speech. Just a man who lived exactly the way he believed was right, breathing his last with peace instead of regret. The world remembers him as a hero. But that's not how Desmond Doss would want it told. He'd want you to know he was just a man who made a promise and kept it, even when keeping it meant standing alone in the worst place imaginable. Time thins near the end of a life. Days blur. Memories sharpen. For Desmond, the ridge never really fades, but it no longer screams. It speaks quietly now, like a reminder instead of a wound. He sits by the window some mornings, sunlight warming hands that once shook under fire, and he thinks about how strange it is that the loudest moments of a life often leave behind the softest echoes. His health declines in small surrenders. A step he can't take anymore. A breath that doesn't come as easily. Doctors adjust words, soften truths. Desmond doesn't need it softened. He's faced harder things than mortality. This is just another descent down a cliff he's already climbed once. Dorothy remains beside him, the same steady presence she's always been. She reads to him when his eyes tire, holds his hand when pain flares. Sometimes they sit without speaking, the silence comfortable, earned. There's nothing left to prove between them. Love, like faith, has already done its work. When visitors slow, when the room grows quieter, Desmond's thoughts drift backward. Not to the metal, not to the speeches, to faces, names he never learned, the weight of bodies in his arms. The moment before each decision, when fear and resolve collided and he chose to move anyway. He wonders where those men ended up. What lives unfolded because he stayed when he could have left? That question brings him peace. Because he never believed the world changes in sweeping gestures. It changes in small, stubborn acts repeated until they matter. One rope lowered, one wound bound, one life pulled back from the edge. The final days are gentle. No alarms, no rush. Just breath coming and going, slower now, softer. Desmond's voice weakens, but his eyes stay clear. When a nurse thanks him for his service, he squeezes her hand and tells her she's the one doing God's work now. She cries. He doesn't understand why. Late one night, when sleep refuses to come, Desmond stares at the ceiling and listens. Not for bombs, not for screams. Just for the quiet rhythm of living continuing around him. Somewhere, an ambulance passes. Somewhere, a medic runs toward danger instead of away from it. Somewhere, someone whispers a prayer they don't know will be answered. He smiles. Because he knows how those prayers work. They don't remove fear. They don't stop pain. They give you the chance to act anyway. As dawn approaches, the room fills with soft light. Dorothy's head rests near his shoulder. Desmond breathes in slowly, then out. His grip loosens. There is no struggle. No regret. Just the calm certainty of a man who never betrayed himself. When it's over, the world doesn't shake. It rarely does for the quiet ones. News spreads slowly. Headlines appear. Tributes follow. Words like hero and legend are used again, carefully polished, safely distant. People share the story the way stories are shared. Cleaned up, simplified, made easier to consume. But the truth is messier. The truth is a frightened man crawling through fire, whispering the same prayer again and again because it's the only thing holding him together. The truth is choosing mercy when violence would be simpler. The truth is standing alone and staying there. That truth doesn't fade. It lives on in every person who hears the story and feels something shift inside them. A question forming. A line being drawn. A quiet decision waiting to be tested. Because someday, somewhere, another ridge will rise. Another impossible choice will appear. And someone will remember that once, a man without a weapon walked into hell and refused to let it win. Long after the room empties, long after the last prayer fades, Desmond Doss's story keeps moving. Not loudly, not like a parade or a headline. It moves the way conviction always does, quietly, from one heart to another, unnoticed until it's needed most. Because stories like his don't belong to history alone. They wait. They wait in moments when anger feels justified, when fear feels reasonable, when compromise feels easier than standing firm. Somewhere, a young soldier hesitates before pulling a trigger. Somewhere, a medic runs toward smoke instead of away from it. Somewhere, a person chooses mercy in a moment where cruelty would be faster, simpler, applauded. They may not know Desmond's name. They may never have heard of Hacksaw Ridge. But they feel the echo of the choice he made. That echo matters. The world will always celebrate strength that destroys. It understands power that dominates. What it struggles to recognize is strength that refuses. The kind that kneels instead of strikes. The kind that holds instead of breaks. The kind that looks at a burning battlefield and decides that saving one life is worth risking everything. Desmond never asked for recognition. He didn't want to be remembered. He only wanted to be faithful to his God, to his conscience, to the promise he made when he was just a boy watching violence tear a family apart. That promise followed him into ridicule, into courtrooms, into war, into hell itself, and it never let him go. On Hacksaw Ridge, surrounded by death, stripped of protection, abandoned by retreating lines, Desmond Doss discovered something the world still wrestles with today. That courage doesn't always come with noise. That faith doesn't require force. That sometimes the bravest act on a battlefield is refusing to become what the battlefield demands. He saved 75 men that night. Some say more. The exact number doesn't matter. What matters is that every one of them was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's future. Lives that continued because one man stayed when logic said leave. That kind of courage can't be trained. It can't be ordered. It can't be forced. It can only be chosen, over and over again. As the years pass, the ridge grows quiet. Nature reclaims the scars. Nature reclaims the scars. Tourists stand where chaos once reigned, trying to imagine the noise, the fear, the impossible choices. Some succeed, most can't. But the ground remembers. And so do the stories carried by those who lived because of him. Desmond Doss didn't win the war. He didn't end violence. He didn't change the world overnight. He changed the direction of it for 75 people. And sometimes that's enough. Because the measure of a life isn't found in how much it takes. It's found in how much it refuses to surrender, especially when surrender would cost someone else everything. In the end, when the weapons are lowered and the noise fades, what remains is the quiet truth Desmond lived by. That even in the darkest places, even when surrounded by fire and fear, a single person choosing compassion can become the strongest force on the battlefield. And that choice is still waiting for whoever needs it next. Mel Gibson didn't come back quietly. After a decade-long exile from Hollywood's directing chair, Hacksaw Ridge arrived in 2016, not as a cautious reintroduction, but as a declaration. Bloody, earnest, and unflinchingly sincere. This is a filmmaker who built his reputation on extremes, and here he found a story that demanded them. Not explosions of bravado or ironic detachment, but conviction. Moral, spiritual, and physical conviction. The result feels less like a calculated awards play and more like a filmmaker grabbing cinema by the collar and saying, "This still matters." Gibson's career has always orbited faith, violence, and sacrifice. Braveheart romanticized martyrdom. The Passion of the Christ immersed audiences in suffering so relentless it bordered on endurance art. Apocalypto stripped dialogue away to reveal survival as a primal language. Hacksaw Ridge doesn't abandon these obsessions. It refines them. The violence is still graphic. The belief is still absolute. But for the first time, Gibson centers a man whose heroism is defined not by what he does to others, but by what he refuses to do at all. That man is Desmond Doss, a real-life World War II medic and Seventh-day Adventist who went into battle without a weapon. Not a symbolic pacifist, a literal one. Gibson didn't stumble onto this story. He was drawn to its paradox. A war movie about nonviolence. A hero who saves lives in the middle of mechanized slaughter. A narrative where faith isn't a background detail, but the engine driving every choice. This isn't subtext. It's the text. And Gibson embraces that head-on, risking accusations of sentimentality or sermonizing rather than sanding down the edges. What makes the film's creative genesis compelling is how out of step it felt with its moment. By 2016, war films had leaned toward moral ambiguity and procedural realism. Think The Hurt Locker or Lone Survivor Competence Under Fire. Brotherhood forged through shared trauma, ethics blurred by necessity. Gibson went the other way. He made a movie that believes, unapologetically, in goodness. Not irony-laced goodness. Not conflicted goodness. Clean, stubborn, almost naive goodness. That's a dangerous choice. It can collapse into cliché. It can feel false. But Gibson commits fully, and that commitment is why the film holds. His vision hinges on contrast. The first half of Hacksaw Ridge is almost disarmingly gentle. Rural Virginia bathed in soft light. Courtship scenes that flirt with old-fashioned romanticism. Training camp sequences that play closer to classical Hollywood than modern grit. This isn't accidental. Gibson lulls you. He establishes a moral baseline, a world where convictions are mocked but not yet punished. When the film pivots to Okinawa, the shift is brutal. Mud replaces grass. Screams replace hymns. And the violence isn't stylized. It's confrontational. Limbs torn apart. Bodies burned. Chaos without choreography. Here's the thing. Gibson's violence has always been accused of excess. But excess is the point. He doesn't want comfort. He wants confrontation. In Hacksaw Ridge, that approach serves a different purpose than before. The gore isn't there to glorify battle. It's there to justify Doss's refusal to participate in killing. When you see what weapons actually do to human bodies, pacifism stops being abstract. It becomes visceral. The film's worldview doesn't argue. It shows. Endlessly. The production itself reflects this clarity of intent. Gibson didn't hedge by softening the material for broader appeal. He didn't chase irony or distance. Instead, he leaned into classical storytelling. Clear heroes, moral certainty, emotional sincerity, filtered through modern technical craft. That balance is the key to the film's identity. Old-school conviction, new-school execution. You feel Gibson reaching back toward the war epics of the 1940s and 1950s, then dragging them through contemporary realism until they bleed. There's also a personal undertone that's hard to ignore. This is a film about redemption without compromise. About standing firm while the world doubts you. About enduring punishment and emerging with integrity intact. Gibson never makes this explicit, but the resonance is there. A director returning after public disgrace, telling a story about a man judged, mocked, and nearly broken, yet ultimately vindicated. The parallel hums beneath the surface, giving the film an added layer of urgency. Most importantly, Gibson's vision refuses cynicism. In an era where sincerity is often treated as weakness, Hacksaw Ridge dares to be earnest. It believes heroism can be quiet. That faith can be strength. That saving lives matters more than taking them. Whether you share that belief or not, the film never apologizes for holding it. And that confidence, earned or not, is what gives the movie its spine. But vision alone doesn't carry a film this demanding. For that, everything depends on how the story was shaped on the page. How a real-life legend was translated into cinematic momentum without tipping into myth. And that foundation, forged through years of writing and rewriting, is where this story truly began. The story of Hacksaw Ridge didn't arrive fully formed. It fought its way there, appropriately, through years of uncertainty, hesitation, and rewrites that wrestled with a central problem. How do you dramatize a man who refuses violence inside one of the most violent genres cinema has to offer? The answer wasn't found in clever narrative tricks or subversive structure. It came through stubborn clarity. The screenplay doesn't try to outsmart the premise. It commits to it fully and builds outward. The film is based on the true story of Desmond Doss, whose actions during the Battle of Okinawa were already the stuff of legend long before Hollywood came calling. The challenge for the writers, Andrew Knight and Robert Schenken, wasn't inventing drama. It was shaping restraint. Real life offered heroics so extreme they risked disbelief. One man, no weapon, dozens of lives saved under fire. The temptation would have been to mythologize. Instead, the script grounds Doss in contradiction, friction, and resistance long before the battlefield enters the frame. Early drafts reportedly leaned heavier on war movie conventions, emphasizing spectacle earlier to hook audiences. That version didn't stick. What finally unlocked the script was delaying the violence and letting character do the heavy lifting. The first act isn't a prologue, it's a thesis. Childhood trauma. A fractured home shaped by a father still bleeding from World War I. Faith not as abstraction, but as habit. Sabbath rules. Scripture memorized, lived, and occasionally weaponized against him. By the time Doss reaches boot camp, the screenplay has already answered the question critics often ask later. Why doesn't he just bend a little? Here's the key writing decision that makes the film work. The script refuses to soften opposition. Authority figures aren't cartoon villains. Fellow soldiers aren't evil bullies. They're pragmatic. Frustrated. Afraid. From their perspective, Doss is dangerous, not because he won't kill, but because his refusal threatens group survival. This choice injects moral tension without cheap antagonism. Everyone believes they're right. That's where drama lives. Structurally, the screenplay adheres to classical three-act form, but the midpoint pivot is sharper than most war films. Training doesn't simply prepare Doss for combat, it nearly destroys his chance to reach it. Court-martial proceedings sit at the narrative center, reframing the movie temporarily as a legal drama. It's a bold move. The war pauses, the weapons stay silent, and the question becomes institutional rather than physical. Does conviction have a place inside a system built on obedience? Dialogue does a lot of quiet work here. Doss isn't verbose. He doesn't sermonize. His faith comes out in plain sentences, almost childlike in their simplicity. That's intentional. The writers avoid theological debate and instead let repetition do the talking. I can't. I won't. I believe. Over and over. Against louder voices. Against smarter arguments. Against ridicule. The power isn't in rhetoric, it's in refusal. Language becomes an extension of character. When the film finally enters Okinawa, the script doesn't change genres. It fulfills a promise. Everything established earlier now collides with reality at full force. And this is where the writing takes its biggest risk. Doss's heroism unfolds through repetition. Rescue after rescue. Prayer after prayer. Just one more. On the page, that kind of structure can feel monotonous. On screen, it becomes ritual. The screenplay understands that belief, to be credible, must be exhausting. Salvation doesn't arrive in a single triumphant beat. It grinds forward. The writers also resist the urge to explain miracles. Doss survives impossible odds, but the script never winks at divine intervention. Bullets miss. Bombs fail. Men live. Why? The film doesn't say. It doesn't need to. Faith isn't proven here. It's practiced. That distinction matters. It keeps the story grounded even as events stretch credibility. One of the most disciplined choices in the screenplay is restraint at the end. There's no inflated speech. No victory monologue. The film closes with acknowledgement, not validation. History speaks. Medals confirm. But the emotional climax already happened on the ridge itself, when the story chose persistence over punctuation. What makes this script endure isn't novelty, it's confidence. Confidence to let a pacifist lead a war film without irony. Confidence to believe audiences will sit with sincerity. Confidence to structure drama around conscience rather than plot twists. That's rare, and it sets the stage for everything that follows. Especially the casting decisions that would determine whether this conviction felt embodied or merely written. Because a script this earnest lives or dies on the person carrying it, and choosing that person turned out to be one of the film's most consequential decisions. Casting Hacksaw Ridge wasn't about star power. It was about credibility. The entire film hinges on believing one man's moral spine can hold under unimaginable pressure. Get that wrong, and no amount of craft saves it. Get it right, and everything else locks into place. The search for Desmond Doss wasn't about finding a hero. It was about finding someone audiences would trust, not to fake one. Andrew Garfield wasn't the obvious choice. In 2016, he was still shaking off the afterimage of Spider-Man, a role that framed him as witty, neurotic, modern. Doss required something else entirely: sincerity without irony, gentleness without weakness, faith without performance. Gibson needed an actor willing to be exposed, emotionally, physically, spiritually, without hiding behind charisma. Garfield had that vulnerability. What he didn't yet have was proof he could anchor a war epic. That uncertainty became the gamble. Garfield approached Doss not as a symbol, but as a human shaped by contradictions. He leaned into softness. The accent isn't polished, it's lived in. The posture is slightly awkward, almost apologetic. He doesn't stride into scenes, he arrives carefully. This was intentional casting against expectation. A more traditionally tough actor might have sold battlefield endurance, but they would have lost the internal struggle. Doss isn't impressive because he's strong. He's impressive because he refuses to become hard. Gibson reportedly connected with Garfield's openness early. The actor's own curiosity about faith, separate from dogma, gave the role an exploratory quality. Garfield didn't play belief as certainty. He played it as commitment renewed every day. That distinction matters. It keeps Doss from becoming sanctified too early. Casting someone comfortable with doubt made conviction feel earned rather than imposed. Opposite Garfield, Teresa Palmer as Dorothy Shute provided emotional grounding. This role could have easily slipped into supportive archetype territory, the patient love interest waiting at home. Instead, Palmer brings steel beneath warmth. Her Dorothy challenges Doss, questions him, pushes back without undermining his core. Casting an actress capable of matching Garfield's sincerity without dissolving into sentiment was essential. Palmer's performance anchors the film's quieter passages, giving the love story weight that later amplifies the stakes of survival. The training camp ensemble reflects another deliberate casting philosophy: familiarity without dominance. Vince Vaughn as Sergeant Howell is a surprising but smart choice. Known primarily for comedy, Vaughn brings unpredictability. His verbal rhythm, fast, sharp, almost abrasive, creates an immediate tonal clash with Garfield's softness, yet Vaughn resists caricature. Beneath the bark is competence, even begrudging respect. Casting a recognizable comedic presence here disarms expectations, making Howell's eventual shift toward understanding feel organic rather than scripted. Sam Worthington's Captain Glover serves a different function. Where Vaughn is volatility, Worthington is authority. His physical presence, shaped by years of action roles, lends credibility to command decisions. Casting him grounds the military hierarchy in familiarity. You believe this man has seen combat. You believe others would follow him. That belief is crucial when Doss's refusal begins to disrupt order. The authority challenging him must feel real. Luke Bracey as Smitty, Doss's primary foil, might be the most important supporting cast choice. Smitty isn't evil. He's scared, competitive, conditioned by expectations of masculinity and loyalty. Bracey plays him with contained resentment that gradually curdles into guilt. Their relationship needed chemistry that could shift from hostility to respect without a single speech explaining the change. Casting an actor capable of that internal modulation gave the arc credibility. The rest of the platoon functions as a textured chorus rather than individualized subplots. This was intentional. Faces become familiar. Names blur. Personalities emerge through reaction rather than exposition. Casting leaned toward actors who could suggest backstory and posture and glance, allowing the film to avoid narrative clutter while still feeling populated by lives at stake. What stands out across the ensemble is restraint. No one overplays patriotism. No one delivers grandstanding speeches about honor. Gibson and his casting team prioritized believability over bravado. Even Hugo Weaving, as Doss's traumatized father, avoids melodrama. His presence carries the weight of a previous war. the consequences of violence bleeding into the next generation. Casting a veteran actor with gravitas allowed the film to externalize trauma without spectacle. This casting approach mirrors the film's broader philosophy: conviction over charisma, commitment over flash. Every major role supports the same tonal goal: sincerity that survives scrutiny. When the violence escalates later, these faces don't feel like movie characters. They feel like men you recognize. That recognition is what makes the battlefield unbearable. Because once the cast was assembled, the next challenge wasn't belief. It was endurance. These actors had to perform war, not simulate it. And the weight of that burden fell heaviest on the shoulders of the man at the center, whose performance would need to carry the film through its most punishing moments. Andrew Garfield carries Hacksaw Ridge on his back, and what's remarkable is how little he tries to prove it. This is not a performance built on dominance or transformation in the obvious sense. There's no swagger, no showy toughness, no moment where the actor announces, "This is my Oscar scene." Instead, Garfield does something far riskier. He stays gentle while the world around him collapses into violence. That restraint is the performance. From the opening scenes, Garfield establishes Desmond Doss as someone physically present but emotionally tuned differently from everyone else. His movements are slightly hesitant. His smile arrives a beat late. He listens more than he speaks. These are not quirks, they're armor. Watch his eyes during early confrontations. They don't harden. They absorb. Garfield plays Doss as a man constantly processing, constantly recommitting to his beliefs in real time. Faith isn't a settled state here. It's an action repeated under pressure. The accent work deserves attention, not because it's flashy, but because it's imperfect. Garfield doesn't polish Doss's Virginia drawl into something cinematic. It wavers. It cracks under stress. Sometimes it nearly disappears. That inconsistency mirrors the character's emotional strain. When Doss is calm, the voice settles. When challenged, it fractures. Subtle, yes, but intentional. It keeps the performance grounded in physical effort rather than theatrical affectation. The training camp sequences are where Garfield's control becomes apparent. Surrounded by louder performances, raised voices, squared shoulders, aggressive posturing, he shrinks without disappearing. That's hard to do. Many actors confuse humility with passivity. Garfield doesn't. Even when Doss is being beaten, mocked, or court-martialed, there's resistance in his stillness. He doesn't fight back, but he doesn't retreat either. His spine stays straight. His gaze stays level. The body says, what the mouth won't, "I'm not moving." One of the most revealing moments comes during the court-martial. Garfield resists the urge to make it a speech. He answers plainly, sometimes awkwardly. He lets silence stretch. You can almost feel the actor choosing not to push emotion forward. That choice forces the audience to lean in. The power comes from understatement. The sense that this man is speaking from a place deeper than rhetoric. He's not persuading, he's testifying. Then comes Okinawa, and the performance shifts. Not in personality, but in physical cost. Garfield's Doss moves differently under fire. He crawls, he drags, he collapses. The body becomes exhausted before the will does. This is where the performance turns brutal. Garfield doesn't play heroism as adrenaline-fueled clarity. He plays it as depletion. Each rescue looks harder than the last. Breath shortens. Limbs shake. Pain accumulates. Faith becomes labor. The repeated prayer. Just one more could have easily tipped into sentimentality. In Garfield's hands, it doesn't. He delivers it less like a plea to God and more like a negotiation with himself. The voice drops. The eyes close. The words barely escape. You don't hear certainty. You hear need. That distinction keeps the moment human. Heroism here isn't triumphant. It's desperate. Garfield's chemistry with the ensemble deepens the performance. His dynamic with Luke Bracey's Smitty evolves almost entirely through physical interaction. Early scenes bristle with tension. Shoulders squared, eyes locked, movements aggressive. Later, those same gestures soften. Respect isn't declared. It's embodied. A nod. A shared glance. A hand extended without comment. Garfield understands that redemption arcs don't require dialogue. They require recognition. Teresa Palmer's presence sharpens Garfield's vulnerability. In scenes with Dorothy, he allows Doss to relax, to laugh, to flirt, to dream. The contrast matters. It reminds us what's at stake beyond survival. Garfield never plays romance as escape. Even in tenderness, there's gravity. You sense that Doss knows what he's risking by going to war, and Garfield lets that awareness sit quietly beneath the smiles. Hugo Weaving's performance as Doss's father gives Garfield an emotional counterweight. Their scenes crackle with unspoken history. Garfield doesn't confront Weaving with anger. He confronts him with disappointment and love coexisting. That's harder. In their climactic exchange, Garfield lets his voice break. Not loudly, not theatrically, but irreversibly. Something fractures. It's the sound of inherited trauma being acknowledged, not healed. What ultimately distinguishes Garfield's performance is refusal. Refusal to harden. Refusal to perform masculinity in expected ways. Refusal to make Doss impressive through domination. He doesn't play a soldier who becomes holy. He plays a believer who becomes resilient. That's a quieter arc, but a deeper one. By the film's end, when real-life footage confirms Doss's legacy, Garfield's work retroactively gains weight. Nothing felt inflated. Nothing felt false. The performance earns the honor rather than borrowing it from history. And in doing so, Garfield delivers something rare. A led performance defined not by transformation into something larger, but by the discipline to remain exactly who the character always was. Yet even the most disciplined led performance doesn't exist in isolation. It gains texture, resistance, and meaning through the people surrounding it. The men who challenge, doubt, break, and ultimately redefine what heroism looks like alongside him. And that ensemble work is what gives Hacksaw Ridge its collective force. If Andrew Garfield's performance is the film's moral compass, the supporting cast provides the resistance that gives that compass meaning. Hacksaw Ridge understands something many war films miss. Heroism only resonates when it's earned against credible opposition. The ensemble doesn't orbit Doss as background noise. They push back. They doubt him. They break around him. And in doing so, they make his choices matter. Vince Vaughn's Sergeant Howell is the film's most surprising piece of casting, and one of its smartest. Vaughn arrives with baggage, decades of fast-talking comedy, irony baked into his screen presence. Gibson uses that expectation, then strips it away. Howell begins as bluster incarnate, loud, profane, aggressively dismissive. Vaughn weaponizes his verbal speed here, turning every insult into a performance of authority. But underneath the volume is something more fragile, a man terrified of losing control in a system where control equals survival. What makes Vaughn's performance work is calibration. He never plays Howell as cruel for sport. His anger comes from fear. Fear that Doss's refusal will get someone killed. Fear that weakness will infect the unit. Fear that ideals don't hold up under fire. As the film progresses, Vaughn subtly drains the bravado from Howell's posture. His voice lowers. His movements slow. By the time Howell defends Doss, the shift feels earned, not scripted. Respect arrives not as apology, but recognition. Sam Worthington's Captain Glover represents institutional authority rather than personal volatility. Where Howell barks, Glover calculates. Worthington brings a calm severity that grounds the military structure. He doesn't hate Doss. He simply can't afford exceptions. That distinction matters. Glover's conflict with Doss isn't emotional. It's operational. Worthington plays him as a man bound by responsibility, not ego. When Glover ultimately supports Doss, it feels less like conversion and more like adaptation, a system bending just enough to accommodate integrity. Luke Bracey's Smitty is the emotional hinge of the ensemble. His antagonism toward Doss isn't ideological. It's personal. Smitty sees Doss as a mirror reflecting everything he fears about himself: doubt, inadequacy, moral uncertainty. Bracey plays that resentment inward, letting it simmer rather than explode. Early scenes crackle with hostility, but the real work happens later, in quiet moments where guilt creeps in. Smitty's eventual change doesn't come through speech or sacrifice. It comes through silence, through a look held too long, through shame acknowledged without words. Teresa Palmer's Dorothy continues to defy the genre's usual limitations for female roles. She isn't simply emotional support. She challenges Doss's rigidity, questions his choices, demands honesty rather than blind devotion. Palmer gives Dorothy agency without aggression. Her strength is conversational, not confrontational. That balance keeps the relationship grounded. When Doss goes to war, Dorothy doesn't become a symbol. She remains a person with her own stakes, her own fears, her own patience wearing thin. Hugo Weaving's Tom Doss might be the ensemble's quietest triumph. As a veteran shattered by World War I, he carries the film's generational trauma. Weaving avoids theatrical grief. His pain leaks out through bitterness, alcoholism, and self-loathing. The scenes between father and son hum with unresolved history. Weaving plays Tom as a man who believes violence is inevitable because it already ruined him. That worldview, colliding with Desmond's refusal, gives the film its deepest philosophical tension. Faith versus damage. Hope versus experience. Around them, the platoon forms a collective presence rather than individualized arcs. Faces recur. Voices overlap. Fear spreads. Courage flickers. Gibson resists turning every soldier into a backstory vignette, and that restraint pays off. The men feel interchangeable in the way real units do, distinct but bound by circumstance. When casualties mount, it doesn't feel like narrative trimming. It feels like war doing what war does, erasing people mid-sentence. The ensemble's greatest strength is coherence. No one pulls focus. No one overreaches. Every performance serves the same tonal goal, grounding belief in human reaction. Skepticism feels real. Anger feels earned. Respect develops slowly, reluctantly, the way it does outside movies. By the time the battle reaches its peak, the supporting cast isn't there to echo Doss's heroism. They're there to contextualize it. Their fear makes his calm extraordinary. Their doubt sharpens his certainty. Their survival validates his refusal. This isn't a lone hero narrative. It's a collective recalibration of what strength looks like under fire. And that recalibration doesn't stop with performance. It extends into the physical world the film constructs. The mud, the uniforms, the weapons, the ridge itself. Because belief may drive the story, but it's the tangible environment that tests it. And the design of that environment is where Hacksaw Ridge turns conviction into something you can almost smell. The physical world of Hacksaw Ridge isn't just a backdrop, it's an argument. Every plank of wood, every uniform seam, every inch of churned mud is designed to test belief against reality. Production design here doesn't decorate the story, it confronts it. The question isn't whether Desmond Doss's convictions are admirable in theory, but whether they can survive contact with a world engineered for destruction. The early environments establish a visual morality. Rural Virginia feels open, breathable, human-scaled. Homes are modest but warm. Wood dominates the frame. Porches, fences, barns, materials that feel worked by hands rather than machines. Colors lean toward earth tones softened by natural light. This isn't nostalgia for its own sake, it's grounding. The production design builds a world where faith feels plausible because life feels personal. Violence hasn't yet industrialized the space. Training camp begins to strip that warmth away. Structures become more rigid. Lines straighten. Geometry tightens. Geometry tightens. Barracks are functional, almost punishing in their simplicity. Beds aligned with military precision. Walls bare. The color palette drains toward khaki and gray. Here, individuality is the first casualty. The design reinforces the idea that this system isn't malicious. It's efficient. There's no room for exception because exceptions disrupt order. Doss's refusal already feels visually out of place. Then comes Okinawa, and the film detonates its visual language. Hacksaw Ridge itself is less a location than a wound. The ridge isn't romanticized terrain, it's scar tissue. Jagged rock formations claw upward. Mud swallows boots. Vegetation looks bruised rather than alive. The production design team built much of this environment practically, and it shows. Nothing feels decorative. Everything looks dangerous to touch. The battlefield is layered vertically, and that choice matters. The climb up the escarpment isn't just tactical, it's symbolic. Soldiers ascend into hell. The top of the ridge isn't elevated ground, it's exposure. The design emphasizes openness without safety. There's nowhere to hide that actually protects you. Craters offer momentary cover, then become graves. Trees are stripped to skeletal remains. Nature itself looks violated. Props do quiet narrative work. Weapons aren't fetishized. They're dirty, jammed, dropped, abandoned. Blood coats metal until it's indistinguishable from rust. Medical tools, stretchers, bandages, morphine syrettes become the film's true instruments of power. Their repeated use gives them weight. A stretcher isn't just an object. It's a promise of survival dragged through chaos. Costume design reinforces character without commentary. Doss's uniform fits like everyone else's, no visual exemption. But his lack of a weapon creates negative space around him. That absence becomes louder than any prompt. As the battle wears on, uniforms degrade uniformly. Rank becomes irrelevant. Blood and mud erase hierarchy. The design choice to let everyone look equally ruined underscores the film's rejection of glamorized warfare. One of the most unsettling design elements is the battlefield's density. Bodies don't disappear after death, they accumulate. The ridge becomes crowded with casualties, living and dead sharing the same space. This wasn't accidental. The production design refuses the cinematic courtesy of clearing the frame. Corpses remain where they fall. Wounded men cry from unseen corners. The environment feels saturated with suffering. You don't escape it by looking away. Fire transforms the space again. Explosions scorch earth and flesh alike. The design team uses scorched textures to blur boundaries. Ground, uniform, body all reduced to the same charred palette. In those moments, the ridge stops feeling like a location and starts feeling like a furnace. Survival becomes less about skill and more about endurance. What's striking is how the production design never bends to comfort Doss's heroism. The ridge doesn't soften because he's there. If anything, it becomes more hostile. Rain turns mud into traps. Night reduces visibility to panic. The environment doesn't reward righteousness, it challenges it. That choice keeps the film honest. Faith doesn't get a visual halo, it gets resistance. Even small details reinforce this philosophy. The rope Doss uses to lower wounded soldiers down the cliff is rough, frayed, imperfect. Hands bleed gripping it. The cliff face tears at bodies as they descend. Salvation isn't smooth, it scrapes. The design insists on consequence even in rescue. By the time the battle subsides, the ridge feels spent, not conquered, exhausted. The environment looks chewed up and discarded, much like the men who fought there. That visual fatigue lingers. You don't leave the ridge feeling victorious, you leave it feeling emptied. This meticulous physical world gives the film its credibility. Without it, belief would feel theoretical. With it, conviction becomes tactile. You can feel what it costs to hold on to faith when the ground itself seems intent on swallowing you whole. And capturing that world, making it readable amid chaos, required more than set construction. It required a camera language capable of navigating violence without losing clarity. Because, once the environment was built, the next challenge was how to see it. And that's where the film's visual execution steps into focus. The most overwhelming sequence in Hacksaw Ridge isn't defined by what happens, it's defined by how it's seen. Cinematography here doesn't chase beauty, it chases comprehension inside chaos. When bullets are flying and bodies are falling, the camera's job isn't to impress, it's to orient. And that's where this film's visual execution separates itself from spectacle-driven war cinema. Cinematographer Simon Duggan approaches the battlefield with a philosophy rooted in immersion rather than elegance. The camera stays close. Too close sometimes. Faces fill the frame mid-scream. Dirt slams into the lens. Smoke obscures orientation. You're not given the luxury of wide, heroic compositions for long. When they appear, they're fleeting, used to establish geography before plunging back into confusion. The effect is destabilizing by design. War doesn't unfold in clean master shots. It fragments. Handheld movement dominates the combat sequences, but it's controlled, not chaotic for chaos's sake. Dogan avoids the jittery incoherence that plagues many modern action films. The camera moves with intent, tracking characters through danger rather than spinning around it. You always know whose experience you're inhabiting. That clarity is crucial, especially during the Ridge rescues. Without it, repetition would blur into noise. Instead, each rescue feels distinct, each rescue recalibrated. Lighting plays a brutal psychological role. Daylight scenes expose everything. There's nowhere to hide, nowhere to soften the violence. Colors bleach under the sun, giving skin a sickly pallor and making blood stand out in harsh contrast. Night sequences, by contrast, swallow detail. Visibility collapses. The camera strains to find faces in darkness, mimicking the soldiers' panic. Flares tear through the black like violent punctuation, briefly revealing horror before plunging it back into shadow. Lens choices reinforce proximity. Wide-angle lenses dominate, distorting edges and exaggerating movement. The battlefield feels stretched, unstable, constantly threatening to spill beyond the frame. Close-ups feel invasive, forcing you into the physical space of suffering. This isn't observational cinematography, it's participatory. You don't watch the ridge, you endure it. One of the most effective visual strategies is repetition with variation. The camera returns again and again to similar movements, crawling shots, over-the-shoulder drags, desperate sprints, but alters framing and rhythm each time. Fatigue accumulates visually. The viewer starts to anticipate danger, just like the characters do. That shared exhaustion becomes part of the storytelling language. The film's use of slow motion is sparing and purposeful. When it appears, it doesn't glorify action. It isolates consequence. A body falling, a hand reaching, a moment suspended just long enough to register loss. Duggan understands that slow motion only works when it contrasts with relentless forward momentum. Here, it punctures the chaos instead of stretching it. Composition shifts subtly when Doss enters the frame, not to sanctify him, but to clarify his path. The camera often frames him against movement, soldiers charging past, explosions detonating behind, while he moves in the opposite direction. Forward becomes backward. Retreat becomes advance. This visual countercurrent reinforces his moral position without a single line of dialogue explaining it. The descent down the cliff is one of the film's visual high points. The camera peers over the edge, tilts with the body, then looks straight down into nothingness. Depth becomes terrifying. Duggan uses vertical space to emphasize vulnerability. Gravity itself becomes an antagonist. These shots don't linger. They drop, mirroring the physical sensation of falling without safety. Color grading maintains a restrained palette throughout. Greens rot into browns. Blues flatten into gray. The environment looks starved of life. When color does punch through, blood red, flare white, it shocks the eye. Violence interrupts the visual monotony the same way it interrupts breath. What's most impressive is how the cinematography resists triumph even during moments of victory. The camera doesn't soar when lives are saved. It stays grounded, low, tired. Rescue isn't framed as conquest. It's framed as survival delayed. That choice preserves the film's integrity. It never lets the audience forget the cost embedded in every frame. By the time the ridge quiets, the camera feels spent. Movement slows. Shots breathe longer. The violence hasn't been conquered. It's simply paused. That visual exhaustion lingers, imprinting itself long after the screen cuts to black. But images alone don't carry that weight. What the eye processes, the ear completes. And if the cinematography immerses you in the chaos, the film's soundscape traps you inside it, guiding emotion, sharpening fear, and occasionally, devastatingly, removing sound altogether to let silence do the damage. Sound is where Hacksaw Ridge tightens the vise. The visuals pull you into the battlefield, but the audio design is what keeps you there. Breath held, nerves shredded, senses overloaded. This is a film that understands something fundamental. War isn't just seen, it's heard. And sometimes, it's felt most powerfully when the sound drops away altogether. Rupert Gregson-Williams' score approaches the material with restraint rather than bombast. That choice is crucial. A more traditional war score, brass-heavy, rhythm-driven, would have imposed heroism where the film is trying to earn it. Instead, the music arrives cautiously, often late, sometimes barely there. When it does surface, it leans on strings and piano, favoring emotional undercurrent over martial grandeur. The score doesn't lead emotion, it follows it. Early cues are gentle, almost pastoral, echoing the film's opening environments. There's an innocence to the melodies, a sense of moral clarity that hasn't yet been tested. As the narrative progresses, those same motifs return altered, slower, strained, fragmented. The music doesn't evolve into something grander. It erodes. That erosion mirrors Desmond Doss's journey, where belief remains intact, but the body carrying it begins to falter. During combat, the score often recedes entirely. This is one of the film's smartest decisions. Instead of telling you how to feel, the soundtrack lets sound design take over. Gunfire cracks without rhythm. Explosions detonate with concussive force. Bullets whine past ears with terrifying proximity. The mix prioritizes immediacy over clarity, layering chaos until individual sounds blur into assault. It's exhausting, and that's the point. What stands out is the texture of the soundscape. This isn't clean audio. It's abrasive, metallic, wet. Flesh meets shrapnel with sickening specificity. Mud squelches under boots. Breath rasps through damaged lungs. The sound design refuses to sanitize violence. You hear suffering before you see it. Sometimes after. Cries echo from off-screen, lingering longer than the image that caused them. The battlefield feels crowded with voices you can't help. Silence becomes the film's most devastating weapon. Not complete silence, never empty, but muted sound, dampened frequencies, moments where the world seems to recede. After explosions, the audio drops into a ringing void, mimicking auditory shock. You're left inside a character's head, disoriented, struggling to reconnect with reality. These moments don't just simulate experience, they create empathy through sensory deprivation. One of the most effective uses of silence occurs during Doss's rescues. As he prays, the chaos pulls back. Gunfire dulls. Screams fade. His voice quiet, cracked cuts through. The mix isolates him without sanctifying him. This isn't divine intervention, it's psychological focus. The sound design places us inside Doss's narrowing attention, where the world reduces to breath, rope, and the weight of another human body. Diegetic sound. Audio that exists within the story world dominates the film. Commands are shouted and lost. Radios crackle uselessly. Metal clangs against stone. Non-diegetic music, when it enters, feels almost intrusive, which is exactly why it's used sparingly. When the score finally swells during moments of collective movement, it feels earned not because it's triumphant, but because it's rare. The film's final battle sequence uses sound escalation with surgical precision. Noise builds, peaks, then fractures. Layers strip away until only the most essential elements remain. A groan. A footstep. A whispered plea. By the time the ridge quiets, the absence of sound feels unnatural. Peace sounds wrong after what we've endured. That discomfort lingers. Gregson, Williams avoids a singular, hummable theme in favor of emotional continuity. The music doesn't announce itself. It seeps in. That subtlety allows the sound design to remain the dominant force. Music supports belief. Sound enforces reality. Together, they create a sensory push and pull that mirrors the film's central tension. The closing moments shift tone gently. Hymns and soft orchestration return, not as victory laps, but as acknowledgement. Survival has occurred. Cost remains. The audio landscape softens without erasing what came before. You remember the noise even in the quiet. By the time the credits roll, your ears feel as battered as your eyes. That's not accidental. Hacksaw Ridge wants you to leave carrying the weight of what you heard, not just what you saw. Because sound is memory's most persistent trigger. And this film understands exactly how to use it. But creating that sensory assault wasn't seamless. Behind the precision lies a production journey marked by physical hardship, logistical strain, and moments where the film itself nearly buckled under the weight of its ambition. And those behind-the-scenes stories reveal just how close Hacksaw Ridge came to becoming something very different. By the time cameras rolled on Hacksaw Ridge, the film already carried a strange weight. This wasn't just another production, it was a comeback, a gamble, and a physical ordeal rolled into one. The behind-the-scenes journey mirrors the film itself, punishing, unglamorous, and driven by stubborn commitment rather than comfort. Filming took place primarily in Australia, with locations transformed into 1940s Virginia and the hellscape of Okinawa. The choice wasn't about convenience, it was about control. Gibson wanted environments he could brutalize without restraint. Sets weren't treated delicately. They were torn apart daily, rebuilt, then destroyed again. Mud pits deepened. Explosions reshaped terrain. Continuity became a logistical nightmare, but realism was non-negotiable. The shoot schedule was demanding, especially during battle sequences. Long days, heavy gear, repeated takes under physically draining conditions. Actors didn't just perform exhaustion, they accumulated it. Andrew Garfield has spoken about how the repetition of rescue scenes wasn't adjusted to make life easier. That was intentional. Gibson wanted fatigue to show up naturally, muscles strained, breath shortened. Performance and endurance collapsed into the same thing. Safety was a constant concern, but not in a way that softened the experience. Stunts were carefully choreographed, yet still brutal. Explosions detonated close enough to feel heat. Debris flew with controlled unpredictability. Actors learned to trust the crew implicitly because hesitation could break rhythm, or worse. That trust created a strange bond on set, mirroring the platoon dynamics portrayed on screen. Gibson's directing style during production was intense but focused. He didn't micromanage performances. He shaped environments. His notes were often blunt, physical, instinctive. Less psychology, more action. Faster. Lower. Again. Actors have described a set where emotional preparation mattered less than presence. You showed up, you endured, you stayed in it. That approach isn't for everyone, but for this film, it forged authenticity. One of the most grueling sequences, the overnight rescue stretch, was shot across multiple days, out of order, under varying weather conditions. Rain turned dirt into suction, cold stiffened fingers. The rope descent scenes were especially taxing, requiring repeated lifts and drops with minimal mechanical assistance. Hands bled, shoulders seized. The film didn't fake effort because it didn't need to. There were moments when the production flirted with collapse. Weather delays threatened schedules. Injuries slowed momentum. Budget constraints forced creative problem-solving rather than compromise. Instead of scaling back, the team condensed setups, shot wider, trusted chaos. Some of the film's most visceral moments emerged from these limitations, happy accidents born from necessity. The cast bonded through shared discomfort. Hierarchies blurred. Stars and supporting actors suffered equally. That equality translated on screen. When men scream, drag, and break together, it looks real because it was. Off-camera camaraderie wasn't cultivated through table reads or workshops. It was forged in mud and exhaustion. Perhaps the most telling behind-the-scenes detail is how little irony existed on set. This wasn't a production constantly commenting on itself. There were no winks, no distance. Gibson set a tone of seriousness that demanded buy-in. You didn't have to share the film's beliefs, but you had to respect them enough to commit fully. When filming wrapped, there was no sense of relief, only depletion. The film had taken something from everyone involved. That cost is visible in the final product. You feel it in the performances, in the pacing, in the refusal to prettify suffering. Hacksaw Ridge looks the way it does because it was made the way it was made. And then came the next test: release, numbers, reception. The cold calculus of whether an uncompromising war film built on sincerity could survive in a market dominated by spectacle and irony. Because conviction may carry a film creatively, but commercially, it has to prove itself all over again. When Hacksaw Ridge hit theaters, it wasn't just testing audience appetite for a war film. It was testing patience for sincerity. This wasn't a franchise entry. No brand safety net. No ironic distance. Just a brutal R-rated war drama led by a pacifist and directed by a man Hollywood hadn't fully forgiven. From a commercial standpoint, that's not a safe bet. It's a dare. The film opened in November 2016, a strategic choice that signaled confidence. Award season loomed, yes, but November is also a proving ground for adult dramas. Audiences show up if the hook is strong. They stay if word spreads. Hacksaw Ridge needed legs more than fireworks, and its opening weekend reflected that reality. The debut was solid rather than explosive respectable numbers that suggested curiosity, not obsession. What happened next mattered more. Instead of the steep drop-offs typical of front-loaded releases, the film held. Week after week, attendance stayed steady. That kind of endurance doesn't come from marketing blitzes. It comes from recommendation. Viewers left shaken, moved, unsettled, and they talked. Churches organized group viewings. Veterans communities embraced it. Older audiences, often underserved by modern theatrical offerings, showed up in force. The film found its people. Internationally, the response was even stronger. Outside the US, the baggage surrounding Gibson carried less weight, and the story's universality traveled well. The film's themes, conviction, sacrifice, moral courage, translated across cultures without dilution. War films traditionally perform well overseas, but Hacksaw Ridge benefited from its specificity. It wasn't selling American dominance. It was selling human resilience. That distinction mattered. From a budgetary standpoint, the film was produced leaner than it looks. The practical effects, controlled locations, and disciplined schedule kept costs in check despite the scale of destruction on screen. That efficiency turned moderate box office success into genuine profitability. This wasn't a runaway blockbuster, but it didn't need to be. It earned its keep, then some. Home media extended its lifespan significantly. Blu-ray and digital sales found an audience that may have avoided theaters due to the film's intensity. Streaming platforms introduced it to new viewers who could pause, breathe, and return. The film aged well in this format. It rewards reflection. It invites revisiting. Financially, that long tail mattered. Awards attention boosted visibility at exactly the right moment. Nominations don't guarantee profit, but they extend conversation. They reframe a film from something intense you might watch into something important you should see. Hacksaw Ridge benefited from that shift. The Oscars didn't create its success, but they amplified it. Commercially, the film proved something studios often forget. Not every hit needs 4 quadrants. You don't have to please everyone to succeed. You have to reach the right audience deeply enough that they carry the message forward. Hacksaw Ridge didn't dominate pop culture, but it embedded itself where it counted. The real victory wasn't the gross total. It was validation. Validation that adult war dramas still had a place. That sincerity wasn't box office poison. That moral clarity, when earned, could still draw crowds. For Gibson, it marked a professional recalibration. For the industry, it was a reminder. But numbers only tell part of the story. Because once the tickets were sold and the dust settled, the conversation shifted. Critics weighed in. Audiences debated. Faith, violence, patriotism all collided in public discourse. And the film's legacy began to take shape not through revenue, but through reaction. The response to Hacksaw Ridge split along lines that had little to do with filmmaking craft and everything to do with belief. Critics didn't argue over whether the film was competently made. That was largely settled. They argued over what it meant to make a war film this sincere, this violent, and this spiritually anchored in the middle of a cynical cinematic era. The debate was the movie's aftershock. Critical consensus leaned positive, but not uniformly enthusiastic. Praise centered on the film's technical execution and Andrew Garfield's performance, which many critics singled out as career-defining. The battle sequences were widely described as harrowing, even punishing. Reviewers acknowledged Gibson's command of large-scale violence. Some reluctantly, others admiringly. The phrase that surfaced repeatedly was uncompromising, used both as compliment and caution. Where opinions diverged sharply was tone. Some critics embraced the film's moral clarity, arguing that its refusal to dilute faith or conviction was exactly what gave it power. Others bristled at what they perceived as sanctification, concerned that the film edged too close to hagiography. The same scenes were interpreted in opposite ways. For one group, Doss's perseverance embodied moral courage. For another, it risked flattening complexity in favor of reverence. Violence became a central point of contention. Gibson's unflinching depiction divided reviewers who admired its honesty from those who felt it overwhelmed the film's message. The paradox wasn't lost on anyone, a pacifist story told through extreme brutality. Supporters argued the gore justified Doss's refusal to kill. Detractors questioned whether the film lingered too long on suffering to maintain moral coherence. Both readings found evidence on screen. Audience reception, however, skewed warmer than critical hesitation suggested. Viewer scores reflected emotional impact more than analytical distance. Many described the film as moving, inspirational, difficult but worthwhile. Faith-based audiences embraced it openly, but the response wasn't limited to them. Veterans and military families found resonance in its depiction of trauma and brotherhood. The film sparked conversation rather than consensus, and that, culturally, is a form of success. Award season reframed the discussion. Nominations validated craft over controversy. The film's recognition for editing and sound design acknowledged technical excellence without weighing in on ideology. Garfield's nomination placed performance above debate. The industry didn't fully endorse Gibson, but it didn't dismiss the work either. The message was clear. Whatever you think of the man, the movie demanded engagement. Culturally, Hacksaw Ridge arrived at a moment when faith-based narratives were often segregated into niche markets. This film refused that categorization. It didn't soften belief to appear palatable, nor did it market itself as devotional cinema. That ambiguity unsettled some critics and intrigued others. It occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, too brutal for easy inspiration, too sincere for ironic distance. Over time, reassessment has softened early skepticism. As the film settled into libraries and streaming catalogs, viewers encountered it without the surrounding discourse. Removed from release week arguments, the craftsmanship became harder to ignore. The violence remained divisive, but the sincerity gained appreciation. The film aged into its convictions rather than out of them. Perhaps the most telling aspect of its cultural response is endurance. Hacksaw Ridge didn't become a meme factory or a quotable phenomenon. It became a reference point. When discussions of war cinema turn to pacifism, it enters the conversation. When debates about faith and filmmaking surface, it's cited. The film didn't dominate culture. It embedded itself quietly, persistently. And that's fitting. This was never a film chasing approval. It was a film asserting belief and accepting consequence. Critical praise, audience admiration, controversy, discomfort. All of it reflects a work that shows conviction over consensus. Whether embraced or resisted, Hacksaw Ridge refused to be ignored. But reaction is only part of legacy. What ultimately determines a film's staying power is what it says beneath the noise. Its fill, its themes, its philosophical weight, and what remains once the debate's quiet. And that final reckoning is where Hacksaw Ridge reveals its deepest intentions. At its core, Hacksaw Ridge is a film about resistance, but not the kind that raises fists or fires back. It's about the quieter, lonelier resistance of holding a line no one else can see. Desmond Doss doesn't fight the enemy so much as he fights inevitability, the assumption that violence is the final answer, that survival requires moral compromise, that goodness must eventually bend. The film's lasting power comes from how seriously it takes that challenge. The central theme is conviction under pressure, not conviction as personality trait, but as repeated action. Doss's faith isn't rewarded immediately. It costs him friends, safety, dignity. He's mocked, beaten, nearly imprisoned. The film is careful here. Belief isn't framed as comfortable or socially affirmed. It's isolating. The ridge becomes the ultimate stress test. Stripping belief down to its most basic function, does it still hold when everything else fails? Running parallel is the film's interrogation of masculinity. Hacksaw Ridge dismantles the idea that strength must be loud, aggressive, or destructive. Doss never outmuscles anyone. He never dominates a space. His strength is endurance, the ability to keep moving toward others when instinct screams retreat. In a genre obsessed with conquest, the film redefines heroism as service. Saving one life becomes more radical than taking many. Violence, paradoxically, is both the film's obstacle and its language. Gibson doesn't shy away from brutality because the film's argument depends on it. The gore forces confrontation. Pacifism here isn't abstract philosophy. It's a reaction to what bullets actually do. The film doesn't sanitize war to make belief easier. It makes war unbearable, so belief becomes urgent. That tension is uncomfortable by design. It asks whether moral clarity can exist without aesthetic comfort. Faith is treated not as spectacle, but as discipline. Doss prays, but prayers don't summon miracles on cue. Men still die. Pain still accumulates. The film refuses to explain why Doss survives when others don't. There's no divine accounting ledger. That ambiguity keeps the story grounded. Faith is portrayed as something lived, not proven. The question isn't whether God intervenes. It's whether belief sustains action when outcomes remain uncertain. Legacy matters here. Hacksaw Ridge arrives in a cinematic landscape often allergic to sincerity. Its refusal to wink or hedge feels almost rebellious. The film doesn't dilute conviction to broaden appeal, nor does it preach to convert. It simply stands. That stance has influenced how later war films approach moral perspective, less interested in nihilism, more willing to entertain clarity without apology. Within Mel Gibson's filmography, this is a turning point. The obsessions remain: suffering, sacrifice, faith. But the posture shifts. Where earlier films leaned toward martyrdom through violence, Hacksaw Ridge finds transcendence through preservation. It's his most restrained work thematically, even as it remains extreme formally. That balance suggests a filmmaker evolving rather than repeating. Andrew Garfield's career, too, bears the mark. This performance reoriented perception, proof that vulnerability could anchor scale. It expanded the range of what a leading man could be in a war film. Not invincible, not ironic, just resolute. The performance lingers because it doesn't chase admiration. It earns respect quietly, scene by scene. Rewatchability comes not from spectacle, but from intention. The battle scenes are harrowing enough that few revisit them casually. But the film rewards return because its meaning deepens. Early scenes gain resonance once you know the cost ahead. Small gestures, smiles, hesitations, quiet refusals carry more weight. It's a film you revisit not to relive excitement, but to reconnect with resolve. Who is this film for? It's for viewers willing to be uncomfortable. For those open to sincerity without cynicism. For anyone curious whether goodness can survive systems designed to crush it. It may alienate audiences seeking escapism or moral ambiguity, and that's okay. Hacksaw Ridge doesn't chase universality. It earns specificity. The film isn't flawless. Its first act leans toward sentimentality. Its violence will always divide. Some arcs resolve more cleanly than real life allows, but those imperfections stem from conviction rather than carelessness. The film chooses intensity over subtlety, clarity over complication. You can argue with those choices, but you can't mistake them. In the end, Hacksaw Ridge leaves behind a simple, unsettling question. What would it cost you to refuse what everyone else accepts? The film doesn't answer for you. It shows one man paying that price repeatedly without guarantee of reward. That image of a lone figure moving backward through chaos, carrying others toward safety, lingers long after the noise fades. That's the film's legacy, not just a war story, a reminder that courage doesn't always look like conquest. Sometimes it looks like persistence. Sometimes it sounds like a whisper, just one more echoing against impossible odds. What Hacksaw Ridge understands, more sharply than most war films, is that Desmond Doss's greatest enemy isn't the Japanese army. It's the institution he volunteered to serve. The conflict between faith and institutional power isn't a subplot here. It's the film's hidden engine. Long before bullets fly, the system closes in. The military, by design, cannot tolerate exception. Obedience isn't just encouraged, it's structural. Orders move downward. Compliance moves upward. This isn't cruelty, it's survival logic. The screenplay and direction are careful to frame authority figures not as villains, but as custodians of a machine that only works if everyone agrees to become interchangeable. Doss's refusal isn't dangerous because it's violent. It's dangerous because it's singular. Training camp becomes a proving ground not of strength, but of conformity. Haircuts erase individuality. Uniforms flatten difference. Language shifts from names to ranks. The film visually reinforces this through repetition. Rows of bodies, synchronized movement, identical responses. Into this system steps a man who insists on retaining moral authorship over his actions. Not loudly, not rebelliously. Calmly. That calm is what rattles everyone. Here's the uncomfortable truth the film exposes. Institutions don't fear dissenters who rage. They fear dissenters who don't. Anger can be punished. Violence can be contained. Quiet refusal? That spreads. Doss doesn't attack authority, he survives it. And survival without compliance threatens the entire logic of command. The court-martial sequence crystallizes this tension. On paper, it's procedural, lawful, by the book. But emotionally, it's suffocating. Doss isn't being tried for cowardice. He's being tried for incompatibility. The question isn't whether he can fight, it's whether belief is allowed to coexist with uniformity. The institution doesn't ask why he believes. It asks whether belief can be standardized. The answer, initially, is no. What makes the scene powerful is its restraint. No grandstanding speeches. No fiery denunciations. Doss speaks plainly. Authority listens impatiently. Power here isn't loud, it's bureaucratic. And that's far more frightening. Because bureaucracy doesn't hate you. It processes you. It erases you politely. Captain Glover and Sergeant Howell embody two faces of institutional response. Howell reacts emotionally, anger masking fear. Glover reacts strategically, rules masking responsibility. Neither is wrong. That's the film's brilliance. The system isn't corrupt, it's incompatible with moral absolutism. And Doss isn't asking to change the system. He's asking to exist inside it without surrendering himself. The eventual accommodation of Doss doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like strain. The system bends, but it doesn't break. And that bending costs everyone something: authority, certainty, comfort. The film refuses to frame this as enlightenment. It's compromise under pressure. Necessary, unstable, temporary. This tension carries into the battlefield. Once the institution's logic fails, once chaos replaces command, Doss becomes invaluable, not because he follows orders better, but because he follows conscience consistently. The irony cuts deep. The same system that tried to erase him now depends on him. Not as a symbol, as a function. What Hacksaw Ridge ultimately argues is unsettling. Institutions can win wars, but they don't define morality. That belongs to individuals willing to absorb the cost of refusal. Doss doesn't dismantle authority. He exposes its limits. And the film never suggests this is scalable. His path isn't a solution. It's an exception that survives by endurance alone. That's why the story resonates beyond faith. Strip away religion, and the question remains brutal. What happens when personal ethics collide with systems that cannot afford nuance? Most films avoid this by choosing sides. Hacksaw Ridge doesn't. It lets the collision stand. Grinding, painful, necessary. And once that collision is understood, the film's next provocation becomes unavoidable. Because if the institution is challenged by belief, the battlefield becomes the language through which that belief is tested. Not gently, not symbolically, but violently. Violence in Hacksaw Ridge isn't excess, it's grammar. Mel Gibson doesn't use brutality as spectacle or shock value. He uses it as a moral language. Every exploded body, every torn limb, every scream that refuses to fade is part of an argument. The film is making relentlessly. If you want to understand pacifism, you must first understand what it's refusing. This is where many viewers recoil, and understandably so. The film's gore is confrontational, even punishing. But that punishment is intentional. Gibson refuses the cinematic shortcut of implied violence because implication allows distance. Distance allows comfort. And comfort would undermine the film's core claim. You cannot argue against killing abstractly while depicting war cleanly. That would be dishonest. Here's the paradox the film embraces. To justify nonviolence, it must show violence in full. Not heroic violence. Not choreographed violence. Destructive violence, the kind that annihilates bodies without meaning. In Saving Private Ryan, brutality establishes realism. In Hacksaw Ridge, brutality establishes urgency. One says, "This is what war is." The other says, "This is why refusal matters." Gibson's camera doesn't linger on violence to glorify it. It lingers to deny you escape. Wounds aren't quick. Deaths aren't tidy. Men don't fall gracefully. They spasm, burn, choke, and vanish mid-scream. The battlefield becomes a conveyor belt of suffering, and the repetition is the point. Violence here isn't climactic. It's monotonous, dehumanizing, endless. That monotony is critical. If violence were rare, Doss's pacifism would feel symbolic. Because it's constant, his refusal becomes radical. Every rescue is an interruption in the machine, a brief pause in the assembly line of death. The film isn't asking you to admire Doss because he's gentle. It's asking you to recognize how absurd gentleness looks inside an environment engineered for annihilation. Critics who accuse the film of contradiction, too violent to be pacifist, miss this structural intent. The violence isn't undermining the message. It is the message's foundation. Pacifism without consequence is philosophy. Pacifism under artillery fire is action. And action requires stakes you can't ignore. Notice how the film handles the enemy. Japanese soldiers are present, lethal, terrifying, but not demonized through caricature. They kill. They die, often brutally. But the camera doesn't linger on their ideology. It lingers on bodies, human bodies. The violence flattens identity. In death, everyone looks the same. That's not subtle, but it's deliberate. Gibson's history complicates this conversation. The Passion of the Christ used violence as spiritual immersion, forcing viewers to sit inside suffering to understand sacrifice. Hacksaw Ridge refines that approach. The suffering isn't redemptive by default, it's contextual. Redemption only emerges through intervention, through Doss's refusal to accept death as inevitable. There's also an ethical risk here, and the film knows it. Show too much violence, and you risk numbing the audience. Hacksaw Ridge flirts with that edge. Some viewers shut down, others disengage. That discomfort isn't a failure, it's a filter. The film isn't trying to convert everyone. It's testing endurance, the same way the Ridge tests belief. What's crucial is that violence never becomes victory. Even successful moments, lives saved, ground held, feel hollow. The aftermath is always quieter, heavier. Relief never curdles into celebration. The film denies catharsis because catharsis would excuse the cost. Survival doesn't erase trauma, it accumulates it. By using violence as moral language, Hacksaw Ridge forces a choice onto the viewer. Either accept the discomfort or reject the premise entirely. There's no middle ground. And that binary mirrors Doss's worldview. He doesn't negotiate with killing. He rejects it outright, fully aware of the price. This is why the film hurts to watch, not because it's graphic, but because it's consistent. It refuses to let the audience separate belief from consequence. You don't get to admire pacifism from a distance. You have to watch what it stands against. And once that argument lands, once the violence has done its brutal work, the conversation shifts again. Because the film doesn't just ask whether Doss's actions are admirable, it asks something more uncomfortable, whether the film itself risks turning reverence into myth. And that question about sanctification, restraint, and whether clarity becomes simplification is where the next tension lives. At some point, every film built on moral clarity faces the same accusation: reverence. Is it honoring conviction or embalming it? Hacksaw Ridge walks that line deliberately, and this is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because the film knows exactly what it's doing and accepts the risk anyway. The charge of hagiography isn't baseless. Desmond Doss is portrayed with remarkable consistency. He doesn't waver in belief. He doesn't fail morally. He doesn't betray his principles under pressure. In modern cinema, that kind of steadfastness often reads as artificial. We're conditioned to equate complexity with contradiction, depth with compromise. A character who remains whole can feel flattened by comparison. But that reaction says as much about contemporary storytelling as it does about the film. Hacksaw Ridge isn't interested in interrogating whether Doss is right. It's interested in observing what happens when someone refuses to negotiate with their conscience. The tension doesn't come from inner conflict. It comes from external friction. The world bends. Doss does not. This is a crucial distinction. The film isn't asking, what if he's wrong? It's asking, what does it cost to be right when right is inconvenient? That shift reframes reverence as discipline rather than sanctification. Doss isn't elevated above others because he's morally superior. He's isolated because he's morally immovable. Still, the danger is real. By refusing to dramatize doubt, the film risks reducing transformation elsewhere. Supporting characters change. Institutions adapt. Violence escalates. Doss remains constant. For some viewers, that asymmetry feels unbalanced. They want cracks, hesitation, a moment where belief falters. The film denies them that moment intentionally. Because hesitation would turn conviction into preference, and preference can be overridden. Hacksaw Ridge argues that some beliefs only matter if they're absolute. Partial pacifism isn't pacifism. Conditional conscience isn't conscience. The film's restraint, its refusal to complicate Doss internally, is the point, not the oversight. Compare this to other biographical war films. Heroes often stumble, fall, redeem themselves through decisive violence. That arc reassures audiences. It confirms the system works. Hacksaw Ridge withholds that comfort. There's no cathartic moral pivot. Doss doesn't grow into heroism. He endures into it. That endurance shifts the ethical burden onto the viewer. If the character doesn't change, then the question becomes ours. Are we uncomfortable because the portrayal lacks nuance, or because it exposes how rarely we encounter uncompromised belief? The film doesn't flatter skepticism. It challenges it. Even the film's visual language resists glorification. Doss isn't framed with divine light or mythic iconography. He's often small in the frame, swallowed by smoke and noise. His heroism is functional, not aesthetic. When others finally acknowledge him, it feels less like canonization and more like exhaustion giving way to respect. The real ethical gamble is whether the film trusts the audience enough to separate admiration from imitation. Hacksaw Ridge doesn't argue that everyone should be like Doss. It presents him as an anomaly, a man whose path is singular, unsustainable, and costly. His success doesn't scale. That's important. He isn't a template. He's a case study. This is where the film shows its restraint most clearly. It doesn't end with a call to action. It ends with acknowledgement. Medals, records, footage. History speaks, not ideology. The film steps back and lets fact replace interpretation. That move resists myth-making even as it honors the man. So is Hacksaw Ridge reverent? Yes, unequivocally. But reverence isn't the same as simplification. The film doesn't deny complexity. It relocates it. Instead of fracturing the protagonist, it fractures the world around him. Instead of dramatizing doubt, it dramatizes consequence. That choice won't satisfy everyone. It isn't meant to, but it's coherent. And coherence, in a film this morally explicit, is a form of honesty. Once that honesty is accepted, the final question isn't whether Doss belongs on a pedestal. It's whether his story belongs within the broader history of war cinema at all, or whether it fundamentally disrupts the genre it inhabits. Desmond Doss doesn't fit comfortably into the lineage of cinematic war heroes, and that discomfort is precisely his significance. War cinema has long relied on a familiar architecture. Soldiers are defined by what they're willing to do when restraint collapses. Courage is measured in aggression, endured or inflicted. Even anti-war films often hinge on reluctant violence, framing killing as tragic but inevitable. Doss breaks that grammar entirely. Look across film history, and pacifist protagonists are rare, especially in combat narratives. When they do appear, they're usually observers, medics on the periphery, or moral commentators sidelined from the action. Hacksaw Ridge refuses that marginalization. Doss isn't adjacent to battle. He's embedded within it. The film doesn't carve out a safe moral lane for him. It drops him into the most violent possible context and dares the genre to accommodate him. Compare him to figures like Captain Miller in Saving Private Ryan. Miller carries moral weight, yes, but his leadership is validated through tactical violence. Or consider Platoon, where internal conflict defines the soldier's soul, but violence remains the currency of survival. These films interrogate war by complicating killing. Hacksaw Ridge interrogates war by removing killing from the protagonist entirely. That's not evolution, it's rupture. Even films that flirt with pacifism often retreat at the climax. The hero must act. The weapon must fire. Doss never crosses that line, not once. The film doesn't engineer a loophole. No accidental discharge. No symbolic violence. His heroism remains structurally incompatible with the genre's expectations, and the genre bends instead. This is why Doss feels less like a character and more like a challenge. He forces war cinema to confront a blind spot, the assumption that moral agency only exists inside violence. By centering a man whose agency is defined by refusal, the film expands what heroism can look like on screen, not as abstraction, as action under fire. Historically, war films that endure tend to redefine something fundamental. All Quiet on the Western Front reframed glory as futility. Apocalypse now turned victory into madness. Hacksaw Ridge reframes heroism as preservation. That's not a small shift. It changes the emotional math. Success isn't measured in enemies neutralized, but in lives carried away from annihilation. This reframing also explains why Doss hasn't spawned imitators. His model doesn't scale narratively. It resists franchising. You can't build a cinematic universe around refusal. His story works because it's singular, extreme, and unsustainable. Most people can't live that way. Most films can't either. That's what gives the story its gravity. Within war cinema's ecosystem, Doss stands closer to figures like Franz Jägerstätter in A Hidden Life than to any traditional soldier archetype. These are characters defined by moral immovability rather than strategic flexibility. Their battles are fought against inevitability itself, and that places Hacksaw Ridge in a smaller, rarer lineage, films that treat conscience as the primary battleground. This also reframes the film's ending. The recognition Doss receives doesn't feel like genre validation. It feels like historical correction. Cinema catches up to a form of heroism it usually overlooks. Not because it's more admirable than others, but because it exposes how narrow our definitions have been. Doss's place in film history isn't as a template, but as a provocation. He asks whether war cinema can imagine courage without dominance, whether endurance can replace conquest, whether refusal can be cinematic without irony. Hacksaw Ridge answers yes, and in doing so, it quietly widens the genre's moral perimeter. And yet, for all its importance, this is not a film people casually revisit. Its legacy isn't comfort. It's residue, which raises the final, lingering question. Not about history or genre, but about us as viewers. Why does this film still hurt to watch? Some films are revisited because they entertain. Hacksaw Ridge is revisited, if it's revisited at all, because it unsettles. And many people don't return to it, not because it isn't good, but because it lingers. The pain doesn't end when the credits roll. It follows you out. That lingering discomfort is not a flaw. It's the film's final, quiet statement. This movie hurts to watch because it refuses emotional anesthesia. There's no ironic buffer, no tonal escape hatch. Modern audiences are trained to metabolize violence through stylization quips, spectacle, rhythm. Hacksaw Ridge denies that relief. When suffering appears, it stays. When fear erupts, it doesn't resolve neatly. The film traps you in duration. Pain takes time. So does rescue. So does endurance. The emotional weight compounds because the film doesn't let you outsource responsibility. There's no moral alibi. You can't dismiss the violence as fantasy or the faith as abstraction. The bodies are real. The beliefs are absolute. You're forced to sit with a man who refuses the easy exits we rely on. Cynicism, detachment, dismissal. Watching someone hold a moral line that firmly can feel accusatory, even if the film never points a finger. That's part of why repeat viewings are rare. The first watch is survival. The second is reckoning. On rewatch, you notice how early the cost is planted. The quiet smile that won't last. The tenderness that feels borrowed. The innocence already under threat. The film becomes heavier once you know where it's going. Not because of plot, but because of inevitability. You're no longer bracing for violence. You're watching conviction walk toward it knowingly. There's also the exhaustion factor. The battle sequences aren't thrilling in retrospect, they're draining. Your body remembers them. The soundscape alone can spike anxiety. Many viewers describe needing breaks, even outside the theater. That physical response is rare, and it's why the film resists casual consumption. You don't put this on in the background. It demands attention and stamina. But the deeper reason it hurts is simpler. Hacksaw Ridge denies moral outsourcing. Doss doesn't give you permission to be passive. He doesn't compromise so you can relax. He doesn't fail so you can feel superior. He holds. And in holding, he exposes how often we don't. That exposure isn't comforting. It's clarifying. The film doesn't argue that everyone should live as Doss did. That would be dishonest. His path is extreme, isolating, nearly lethal. What it does suggest is more unsettling, that integrity has a cost, and avoidance has one too. The movie doesn't judge which is higher. It just shows you both and refuses to soften either. That's why the final images land the way they do. Not triumphant, not cleansing, just factual. History confirms the story, but it doesn't absolve it. The medals don't erase the screams. The honor doesn't undo the damage. Recognition arrives after the body has already paid the price. In the end, Hacksaw Ridge doesn't want to be loved. It wants to be remembered, uneasily. It wants to sit somewhere behind the ribs, pressing lightly, reminding you that courage isn't always loud, that violence isn't always necessary, and that conviction, when taken seriously, is terrifying. That's why it still hurts to watch, not because it shows pain, but because it refuses to let you look away from what endurance actually costs.